hum of the projector filled the room, a steady, rhythmic sound that had become almost comforting over the years. The Golden Lantern Cinema, tucked away on the quieter side of town, had seen better days. The once vibrant marquee, now faded and peeling, still announced the weekend showings, though fewer people seemed to notice anymore. Still, it held a certain charm, the kind of place where the floors creaked underfoot and the air always smelled faintly of stale popcorn and dust. It was the kind of theater that felt familiar, like slipping into an old jacket that was just a little too big, but somehow it still fit. Isaac had been working at the Golden Lantern for almost 3 years. He'd started as an usher, sweeping up popcorn kernels and checking tickets before moving up to projectionist. There was a simple comfort to the routine. His mornings started early, the soft yellow light spilling into the narrow hallway of his small apartment, where the sound of the coffee machine bubbling in the kitchen always seemed to match the stillness of the early hours. He'd stretch, make his coffee, and glance at the list of movies for the day, mentally preparing for whatever film the theater was showing that week. Some were old classics, others were the kind of low-budget thrillers no one really talked about. But it didn't matter much. The work was steady, the days predictable, and the customers mostly quiet. The Golden Lantern was not the kind of place you'd find packed with people. On most days there were only a few souls scattered in the dimly lit theater, most of them too engrossed in their snacks or the screen to notice the peeling red velvet curtains or the flickering lights above. It was the type of place that didn't care much for grandeur or popularity. It was small, cozy, and, in its own way, comforting. To Isaac, it was just part of his life now. A job, sure, but also a place that had its own rhythm, like the flicker of the film, the buzz of the concession stand, the soft murmurs of patrons slipping in and out of rows. The manager, Carl, was a quiet man, always polite, always on time. He had a way of slipping in and out of the office without anyone really noticing. He'd give Isaac a nod in the morning, sometimes even a smile, but that was about as much as they exchanged. The work was solitary in a way that made it easy to slip into autopilot. Carl never seemed to mind. He'd pop in once or twice to check on things, checking the schedule, making sure the popcorn machine didn't break down, the lights were dimmed just right for the movies. It was a smooth operation, the kind of place that made you feel like you were part of something, just a little bit special. Isaac's favorite part of the day was just after the last film ended, when he'd sit in the projection room alone. The theater would be empty, the echoes of the movie still lingering in the walls, and Isaac would let the sound of the projector's hum soothe him as he made his notes for the next day. There was something peaceful about that quiet time, when the audience had left, when the doors were locked, and he could be by himself in the space that felt like his own. Sometimes Carl would leave him to lock up. "You got it, Isaac?" he'd ask, with that calm tone of his. And Isaac would always nod, knowing that for the next half hour, he'd have the entire building to himself. The lights were dim, and the dark corners of the theater felt far away from the flickering glow of the projector. It was a routine, a rhythm that Isaac had grown used to. Nothing out of the ordinary, just another night at the Golden Lantern. But there was a quiet undercurrent to it all, a subtle, almost imperceptible weight in the air that Isaac couldn't quite place. He'd always written it off as the oldness of the place, the creaks, the groans of the floorboards, the occasional strange shadow passing just out of the corner of his eye. The Golden Lantern had its quirks, sure, But to Isaac, it was just part of the atmosphere, part of what made it feel like home. He had learned the building's rhythm well, the soft whoosh of the heater kicking on when it got too cold, the way the lights flickered when the wind picked up outside, the slow hiss of the popcorn machine every time it was refilled. Nothing that felt out of the ordinary, nothing that made him think twice. It was just another evening in the long stretch of uneventful days. The evening where Isaac took his usual place in the projection room, flicking through the schedule for tomorrow, making sure the equipment was in place. Another night of routine, until the world outside felt just a little too quiet. The night had begun to settle in, casting long shadows across the empty rows of seats. Isaac flicked the switch on the projector one last time for the evening, and the whirring sound softened into a low hum as the reel came to an end. He glanced at the clock on the wall. Almost 11:30 p.m. Another shift done. The movie theater was silent, save for the faint squeak of the old ventilation system that hummed somewhere far above him, hidden in the rafters. He stood, stretching his legs with a tired sigh. The moviegoers had trickled out one by one, most of them silent, not a word spoken, their faces lit only by the glow of their phones. He had gotten used to this. The late-night crowd was always a bit distant, a bit disengaged. He never minded. It was part of the rhythm. They came, they watched, they left. Isaac grabbed his jacket from the back of his chair, the leather feeling cold against his skin. He zipped it up halfway and made his way toward the back hallway, the fluorescent lights flickering above him, casting an eerie buzz through the space. The hall was mostly empty, save for the small pile of trash left from the evening shows. He picked it up without thinking, stuffing it into the nearest bin. The routine was automatic by now. Clear the trash, sweep the floors, make sure everything was set for tomorrow. Carl had already gone home, as usual. The manager never stayed late. He preferred to get his rest. Isaac never minded that either. There was something about the solitude of these late nights that brought a strange comfort. In the quiet there were no demands, no expectations, just the sound of his own footsteps, the occasional creak of the floorboards under his shoes, and the soft hum of the building around him. He finished sweeping the lobby, and his eyes lingered on the marquee through the large glass doors. Outside, the street was quiet, the glow from the lampposts casting pools of light onto the damp pavement. It had rained earlier, the streets still slick with water. Isaac couldn't remember the last time it had been this calm in the neighborhood. The usual background noise of passing cars, people talking, and the occasional siren was absent. Just the kind of night that felt like it could stretch on forever, slow and unbroken. He made his way to the back office to drop off the broom and dustpan. The room was small, dimly lit, with a low hum from the refrigerator in the corner, its dull sound filling the otherwise still air. The clock on the wall read just past midnight now. Time seemed to pass differently here, in this place. It always felt like it was both too slow and too fast at once. Isaac ran a hand through his hair, rubbing his tired eyes. He'd been doing this job long enough to know every corner, every nook and cranny of the theater. There were certain areas of the building that always felt a little off to him, places he didn't like to linger in too long. The upstairs storage room, where the old projection reels were kept, always had a strange smell, a mix of mold and something metallic. The restrooms were always a little colder than the rest of the building, like the air just didn't circulate properly. But he'd never thought much of it. Old buildings had their quirks, and the golden lantern was certainly no exception. Isaac grabbed his coat again and pulled it on fully, stepping into the dark hallway that led toward the exit. The front doors of the theater loomed ahead, the glass reflecting the dim light from the street outside. He glanced over his shoulder toward the projection room, where the faint glow of the projector could still be seen from under the door. It was strange, he thought. He had already turned the projector off. It should have been dark by now. But then again, Isaac was no stranger to the oddities of the building. He had once convinced himself he saw a flicker of movement through the little window in the projection room door, only to find it empty when he went inside. The theater had its mysteries, sure, but it wasn't the kind of place that inspired fear. It was just old, just a little out of sync with the rest of the world. That's all. He hesitated for a moment, the quiet of the hallway settling around him, the kind of stillness that could either calm or unsettle a person, depending on their mood. Isaac felt a fleeting urge to go back, check the projector one more time, but the feeling passed just as quickly as it had come. No need for that. It wasn't anything to worry about. With a deep breath, Isaac pulled open the heavy theater doors and stepped out into the cool night air. The street, as always, seemed empty. Not a soul in sight. The only sound was the soft pattering of rain against the pavement and the distant hum of a car engine somewhere far off. He pulled his jacket tighter around him and began walking toward his apartment, the streetlights casting long, uneven shadows along the sidewalk. The rhythm of the night returned to normal. The world outside felt predictable again, the way it always did when you stepped away from the quiet of the theater. But something lingered in Isaac's mind, a flicker of unease that he couldn't quite shake. It wasn't anything clear, nothing he could name or point to, just that nagging feeling that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone as he thought. But for now, he shook it off. There were no signs of anything wrong, and tomorrow would be another day. A slow, uneventful day. The next morning came slowly, the gray light of early dawn creeping in through the cracks of Isaac's blinds. It wasn't an unpleasant morning, but something about it felt off. Maybe it was the quiet, the absence of the usual sounds of the city stirring awake. He pushed the thought away, rubbing his eyes as he reached for the mug of coffee he had left on the counter the night before. The cold ceramic felt oddly familiar, almost comforting, as his fingers wrapped around the handle. The bus ride to work was uneventful, as always. Isaac stared out the window, watching the familiar landmarks pass by. Denny's on the corner, the gas station with the flickering neon sign, the park with its old swing swaying gently in the wind. Nothing out of place. Everything as it should be. Yet, despite the calmness of the morning, something lingered in the back of his mind, like a small, nagging thought that refused to be shaken off. When he arrived at the Golden Lantern, the lobby was as quiet as it always was in the mornings. The light fixtures still had that dull, yellowish hue, casting an odd glow over the faded carpet. It almost looked like the place had been frozen in time, unchanged by the years that had passed outside. Isaac took a moment to breathe it all in. The stale air, the faint smell of buttered popcorn that clung to the walls, the hum of the refrigerator in the back office. But as he walked toward the projection room, something caught his attention. The door, which was always left slightly ajar to let in the cooling air from the hallway, was now shut. That wasn't unusual, not entirely. There were days when Carl would come in early to check on things, but that felt different today. The door was too closed, like something about it had been sealed off. Isaac paused at the door, his hand hovering over the doorknob. The faint sound of the projector's hum, a sound he had grown used to, almost like a second heartbeat for the theater, was absent. The room was quiet, unnervingly so. He reached out and turned the knob, the soft creak of the door breaking the silence. The air inside the projection room felt heavier than usual, as if it had been shut in for too long. Isaac stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room, taking in the familiar details. The old projector on the far side, the stacks of film reels lined up neatly on the shelves, the small window that offered a view into the theater. Everything was as it should be. Everything, except for the faint, almost imperceptible scent of something wrong. It wasn't the musty smell of old film or the stale air that lingered in the corners. No, this was different. A sharp, metallic scent like copper, mixed with the faintest trace of something burned. Isaac frowned, looking around the room again, but he couldn't see anything that would explain it. The projector sat still, untouched. The screen on the far wall was dark, and yet Isaac couldn't shake the feeling that something had been off about this room all along, that he'd missed something before. Maybe it was the way the shadows played against the walls, twisting slightly under the dim light, or the way the floorboards creaked a little too much when he stepped, echoing in the otherwise still room. He shook his head. "It's nothing," he told himself. The room was just old. It made noises. Everything had a smell sometimes. The unease he felt had no name, no clear cause. It was simply the theater's rhythm, pulling at him in ways he didn't fully understand. He went over to the projector, checking the reel. It was in place, running smoothly. No sign of anything unusual. Isaac exhaled, pushing the thoughts from his mind. He had work to do. The theater would open in a few hours, and it was just another day. But as he left the projection room and made his way through the darkened lobby, he noticed something else. The faint marks on the floor near the front row of seats. Small, uneven impressions like something or someone had dragged across the carpet in the dark. Isaac stopped, staring at them for a long moment. His brow furrowed. That wasn't here yesterday, he thought, but it was hard to be certain. The way the marks faded out toward the back of the theater, almost as if they had been erased halfway. For a second, Isaac considered investigating further, but the theater was opening soon, and he had other things to focus on. He decided to let it go. After all, things in old places like this weren't always as they seemed. Maybe it was nothing more than his imagination running wild. Still, as he made his way to the concession stand to check the supplies for the day, the feeling of something just out of reach, something unnamed, continued to nudge at him. It was small, subtle, a lingering feeling that the theater, in its stillness, was somehow waiting for something to happen, something he wasn't yet ready to see. Isaac was cleaning the lobby when he heard it, faint but unmistakable, the sound of something scraping across the floor. His breath caught in his throat. He paused, his broom frozen mid-sweep, his ears straining in the stillness of the theater. The noise came again, dragging slowly across the worn carpet, a dull, hollow sound that sent a shiver crawling up his spine. It was coming from the front of the theater. For a moment, Isaac stood there, unsure whether to move, unsure if his mind was playing tricks on him again. "It's nothing," he told himself, but the words felt empty in the silence. The sound was too distinct, too deliberate to be ignored this time. Slowly, Isaac set the broom down, his hands trembling just slightly. He glanced toward the projection room door, half expecting to see it swing open or hear the hum of the machine again. But nothing. The theater was still. Too still. It felt as though the entire place had paused, holding its breath along with him. Another scrape. Closer this time. Isaac's heart began to beat harder in his chest, the sound loud in his own ears. The noise was coming from the middle of the theater now, near the rows of seats, as if something or someone was dragging itself along the floor, moving with a slow, deliberate rhythm. His feet moved before he could think, carrying him toward the source of the sound. The lobby lights flickered overhead, casting erratic shadows across the worn carpeting. He didn't want to go into the theater. His instincts screamed at him to turn back, to leave, but the pull was stronger than the fear. It felt like something was calling him, something pulling him forward, deeper into the building. He reached the edge of the theater doors, his hand trembling as he touched the cold metal handle. The scrape stopped, leaving only the sound of Isaac's own shallow breathing. His heart was pounding now, a hard thud in his chest that drowned out everything else. With a quick, anxious breath, he pushed the doors open. The air inside the theater was colder than he remembered, a sharp chill that bit into his skin. The rows of seats stretched out before him in the dim light, the shadows shifting unnaturally in the corners. The smell of burnt copper still lingered faintly in the air, mixing with the musty scent of old velvet and dust. He stepped inside, the door closing behind him with a soft thud. The scrape of the carpet started again, distant but growing nearer. This time, Isaac could feel it. A presence. Something was here. He stood frozen for a moment, listening. His breath was too loud, his heartbeat too fast, but the scrape came again, slowly. So slowly it felt like time itself had stretched out in the dark. It was as though something was inching its way toward him, dragging itself across the theater floor, taking its time, savoring the moment. Isaac took a step forward, his shoes making a soft, nervous squeak against the floor. The scrape stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. Isaac's skin prickled, a cold sweat beginning to form on the back of his neck. He wasn't sure if he was being followed, if something was watching him from the shadows, but the sensation pressed down on him, heavy and suffocating. And then, he heard it. A whisper, faint, barely audible, but it was there. It came from the back of the theater, just beyond the last row of seats. A voice, a word maybe. He couldn't make it out, but the sound sent a jolt of panic through his body. The air felt thick, oppressive, as though it were closing in around him. Isaac's breath came in short, quick bursts now. He tried to back away, but his feet wouldn't move. The scrape started again, louder this time, almost a dragging shuffle. It was closer, so close, that Isaac could hear the rustle of something dragging along the floor, the faint whispering growing more distinct. Isaac. His name. It was clear now. It was a voice, soft, pleading, and yet somehow wrong. The tone sent a chill through his entire body. It wasn't Carl. It wasn't anyone he knew. It was something else. Something that didn't belong in this theater, in this place. It was as though the voice came from the walls themselves, the shadows whispering his name from every corner. Isaac's breath hitched in his throat as he turned sharply toward the back of the theater, the dark shadows of the last rows of seats flickering oddly in the dim light. His heart was pounding in his ears, and his hands were slick with sweat. He should leave. He should run. But something was keeping him rooted in place, a force that pressed against his chest, heavy and suffocating, as though something was holding him here, forcing him to stay. The scraping sound grew louder, now unmistakable. It was unmistakably the sound of something moving, dragging itself along the floor. The voice called again, its whisper growing louder and more insistent. "Isaac, come closer." The seats near the back row shifted, groaning under an unseen weight. Isaac's eyes widened. Something was there, something that was not supposed to be there. He could feel it, the presence pressing against him, tugging at the edges of his mind. The room seemed to stretch, grow darker, as though the walls themselves were closing in. Isaac's legs finally responded, his instincts kicking in, and he stumbled back toward the aisle, his breath ragged, chest tight with panic. His hands grasped at the back of a seat, his fingers cold and shaking as he tried to steady himself. But as he did, the whispering stopped. Silence. A silence so thick, so complete, it seemed to swallow him whole. And then, just before he could turn to run, the lights flickered once more. In that brief, stuttering moment of darkness, Isaac felt it. A presence behind him, so close he could feel the cold breath on his neck, the heat of something that shouldn't have been there. Something reached for him. Isaac's breath froze in his chest as the darkness deepened. The cold against his skin wasn't the chill of the air. It was something else, something that had weight. His body tensed, muscles locked in place. But no matter how hard he tried to move, to run, his legs wouldn't cooperate. It felt as if the shadows themselves were pulling him back, weighing him down. His hand shot out to the seat beside him, gripping it so hard his knuckles turned white. The darkness around him was thick, suffocating, yet in the stillness, he could feel it, the thing behind him, the soft rustling of fabric, the whisper of a voice too faint to make out, a breath near his ear. He closed his eyes, willing himself to move, to flee, but his body felt like stone, frozen in place. His heart pounded in his ears, the beat so loud it drowned out everything else. The scraping sounds, the whispers, the shifting of the chairs, everything was reduced to a pounding, desperate rhythm that belonged only to him. He could feel it now. The presence. Whatever it was, whatever had been waiting in the shadows, it was here, close, and it was no longer hidden. His pulse thundered in his throat, but still, the thing behind him did not move. It simply was, lingering, its presence filling the space between every breath he took. He could sense its coldness, a presence that was not of this world, not of this time. It was like a memory he couldn't quite recall, a distant dream that had been left half-formed in the dark recesses of his mind. And then, without warning, the lights flickered again. This time, they stayed off longer, the silence stretching out into unbearable tension. The air in the room seemed to grow thicker, the weight of it pressing against him, suffocating him, as if the theater itself was breathing with him. The whisper came again, closer this time. The words were clearer, yet they carried a hollow, hollow sound, like they were being spoken from far, far away. "Isaac." The voice was soft, familiar but wrong. It wasn't his name anymore. It was something else. A question he didn't understand, an invitation, or a command. Something was calling him. The presence behind him reached out again, its touch almost gentle, like fingers brushing against the back of his neck, icy and unfamiliar. He could feel the sensation, slick and cold, as though something was crawling along his spine, trying to pull him into the dark. No, I have to leave. The thought came suddenly, a spark of clarity in the confusion of his fear. Isaac turned with all the strength he could muster, his legs finally moving, scrambling toward the aisle. His fingers clawed at the backs of the chairs as he rushed forward, the shadows snapping at his heels, urging him to stop, to turn back, to give in. His breath was ragged, shallow, each step feeling heavier than the last. He reached the edge of the aisle near the exit. The door, his way out, was just a few feet away. He could taste the fresh air, the light beyond the walls of this old theater, where the real world waited for him. Just a few more steps. He reached the door, his hand slamming against the metal handle, but it wouldn't budge. His heart sank. The door was locked. It had never been locked before. Isaac stepped back, his pulse racing as he tugged desperately at the handle, his breath a frantic rush of panic. The coldness around him grew more intense, pressing in from all sides. He could feel it now. The thing, the presence, was inside him, inside the theater, inside his thoughts. It was closing in, forcing him to stay. It wasn't about escape anymore. It was about being trapped, about being contained, in a place he no longer recognized. The whisper came again, louder now. His name, dragged out into the night, echoing through the theater like a call to a forgotten past. He pressed his forehead against the door, willing it to open, but the cold, dark touch of whatever was behind him crept closer again, slithering over his skin like ice. The voice in the shadows seemed to laugh softly, a sound that chilled him to the bone. It wasn't mocking. It was familiar. Isaac took a step back from the door, eyes darting across the theater. His breath came faster, desperate now. What was it? What was it? He didn't know, but it was real. It was there. And then, for a brief, fleeting second, everything stopped. The lights flickered again, and for a fraction of a moment, Isaac saw it. Not in the corner of his eye, but there, directly in front of him. A figure, but not human. Not at all. It was tall, unnaturally so, its shape barely discernible in the flickering light. Shadows twisted around it, swirling like smoke. Its face was nothing, just a void. A hole where eyes should have been. A darkness that pulled everything around it into itself. Isaac staggered back, terror flooding his veins. The figure moved, its form stretching, growing, reaching for him. And for the briefest moment, Isaac realized with a sickening certainty, this wasn't the first time he had seen it. This wasn't the first time it had called him. He had been here before. The moment the thought crossed his mind, the door behind him burst open. A rush of cold air filled the theater. Isaac turned, gasping for breath. But when he looked back, the figure was gone. The theater was silent once more, but the presence was still there, waiting. It hadn't left, and it was never meant to. Isaac stood there for a long moment, not daring to move. The air had grown thick, heavy with an unspoken understanding. And just as the last flicker of light buzzed out, the whisper came again. This time, there was no mistaking it. Welcome back, Isaac. And in the distance, behind him, the soft click of the projector started again.